Flight UK 944 departed Mumbai bound for Delhi on an Airbus A320neo. The aircraft belonged to a modern generation of single-aisle jets designed for short and medium-haul routes. These aircraft combine advanced automation, efficient engines, precise navigation, and systems that allow for high safety margins. However, no commercial aircraft can ignore one fundamental rule. To land, the runway must be usable. In aviation, a usable runway must have sufficient visibility, wind within limits, a suitable surface, separation from other traffic, and a stable approach. If any of these conditions deteriorate, the runway ceases to be an immediate solution and becomes a source of risk. During the route to Delhi, the flight entered a storm-affected area. In northern India, the monsoon can produce rapid weather changes. An approach that seemed possible minutes earlier can become unacceptable due to heavy rain, shifting winds, convective clouds, or reduced visibility. The aircraft does not need to be within the eye of a storm to be affected by it. It is enough for the destination airport to be within an unstable environment. The crew approached Delhi. In a normal operation, the descent follows an orderly sequence: speed reduction, flap setup, landing gear down, runway alignment, and acquisition of a descent path. The cockpit monitors power, altitude, wind, vertical speed, and distance to the threshold. Everything seems calculated, but weather introduces variables that change abruptly. On the approach to Delhi's runway 29, a key concern emerged: the tailwind. An aircraft lands better into the wind because it reduces ground speed. With a tailwind, the aircraft travels more distance over the runway, requiring more braking and losing margin. If the runway is wet, the problem is compounded. The combination of rain, a contaminated surface, and a tailwind can turn an acceptable approach into an unsafe one. At low altitude, when the runway should have become a clear visual reference, the operation no longer offered the necessary margin. The crew decided to go abort the approach. In aviation, a go abort is not a defeat. It is a protective maneuver. The plane applies power, abandons the descent, ascends, and repositions itself to attempt another strategy. For passengers, this maneuver can feel like a shock. The plane seemed about to land and suddenly climbed again. For the cockpit, however, the procedure has a precise logic. An unstable approach should not be forced. If the wind, visibility, trajectory, or energy do not meet safety criteria, the landing is aborted. The problem began when the missed approach didn't resolve the situation but instead triggered a more complex chain of events. Delhi was still experiencing bad weather. The aircraft needed an alternate airport. In commercial flight planning, fuel isn't calculated solely for reaching the destination. It also includes contingency, holding, diversion, and final reserve. This structure allows an aircraft to avoid being dependent on a single runway. But these reserves are not infinite. Every minute spent holding consumes fuel. Every missed approach consumes fuel. Every course change consumes fuel. Flight safety depends on keeping options open, and fuel is what sustains those options. After the failed attempt in Delhi, Vistara 944 diverted to Lucknow, located to the east. On paper, Lucknow was a reasonable alternative. It had the infrastructure to receive an A320 and was within the flight's range. But in aviation, an alternate airport isn't a sure thing. It's a possibility that must remain viable when the aircraft arrives. That detail was decisive. The journey to Lucknow added distance, time, and fuel consumption. The aircraft had left Delhi behind and was heading for the alternate airport. From the outside, the situation might have seemed under control. If the destination wasn't available, another airport would receive the flight. But the weather doesn't obey flight plans. A storm can close an operational window in a matter of minutes. As they approached Lucknow, conditions deteriorated. Visibility decreased, and a storm hit the airport area. The aircraft prepared to land on runway 27, but that runway was practically unavailable. The crew knew where they were. The instruments located them. Air traffic control was guiding the operation. What was lacking was sufficient visual reference to complete the landing safely. On an instrument approach, the aircraft can descend guided by navigation systems. It can follow a lateral signal, a vertical path, or a published procedure. But at a certain altitude, the crew needs visual references. The approach lights, runway lights, threshold, or markings must be clearly visible. If they are not, the approach must be aborted. This principle exists because landing isn't just about touching the ground. It's about aligning the aircraft, reducing the rate of descent, flared the landing gear, grounding the main landing gear within the correct zone, and braking within the available distance. If the runway appears too late or only partially, that margin disappears. Runway visibility is measured using specific parameters. One of the most important is RVR, Runway Visual Range. This value indicates the distance at which a pilot can see runway lights or markings from the centerline. In heavy rain, fog, or thunderstorms, RVR can drop rapidly. An airport can be above minimums one moment and below them shortly after. This turns the approach into a technical challenge. The runway exists, but it's unusable. The aircraft is close, but it can't proceed. The crew shouldn't attempt a desperate visual search. If there aren't sufficient references to the minimum altitude, the correct maneuver is a missed approach. The first landing attempt at Lucknow also ended in a missed approach. The aircraft took to the air again. For the passengers, the sequence may have been disconcerting. Descent, expectation of landing, power increase, and climb. For the crew, the situation became more demanding because the fuel level had dropped significantly since departing Delhi. From that point on, the alternatives became limited. Kanpur emerged as a possibility. Prayagraj, then also known as Allahabad, emerged as another. Each airport offered advantages and risks. Distance, weather, runway length, available services, technical assistance, passenger capacity, and estimated fuel for landing. In a fuel emergency, the ideal airport isn't always the most convenient. The right airport is the one where a safe landing can be made before the final fuel reserve is compromised. Logistics matter, but the priority is the nearest usable runway under safe conditions. Vistara 944 began its course for Prayagraj. During this en route, Lucknow reported improved conditions. Visibility increased, and the runway was back within minimums. The aircraft was closer to Lucknow than to Prayagraj, so turning back became the shortest option to an available runway. The decision made operational sense, but it also revealed how narrow the margin was. If Lucknow deteriorated again, the options would be severely limited. If the aircraft continued toward Prayagraj, the fuel might not last long enough. Aviation safety isn't always a choice between a good option and a bad one. Sometimes it forces you to choose between risks that change by the minute. Aviation distinguishes between several types of planned fuel. There's en route fuel, calculated for the intended route. There's contingency fuel, which covers reasonable variations. There's alternate fuel, necessary if the destination cannot receive the flight. And there's final reserve, which should not be used as a normal part of the strategy. That reserve exists to protect the aircraft against unforeseen circumstances. On Vistara 944, the chain of events consumed fuel progressively. A wait near Delhi, a missed approach, a diversion to Lucknow, a missed approach at Lucknow, a course to another alternate airport, and a return to Lucknow when conditions improved. None of these elements, taken in isolation, explained the full severity of the situation. The emergency arose from accumulation. Low fuel does not mean the engines are about to shut down. It means that any further delays could lead to the aircraft landing with less than its planned final fuel reserve. It is an operational declaration. The aircraft needs priority because it can no longer accept holding patterns, long vectors, or unnecessary delays. A fuel emergency represents a higher level of concern. When a crew declares Mayday Fuel, they are communicating that the estimated fuel upon landing at the nearest usable airport will be less than the planned final fuel reserve. In aeronautical radio communications, Mayday is an international signal of grave distress. By adding fuel, the crew precisely identifies the threat. The technical mystery of the case did not lie in a visible mechanical failure. I was faced with a more uncomfortable question. How could a modern aircraft, with extra fuel and a trained crew, achieve such a narrow margin? The answer didn't depend on a single spectacular decision. It depended on a sequence where the environment changed faster than the strategy. The crew hadn't taken off with the intention of burning through fuel reserves. The aircraft wasn't lost. The systems didn't fail. The destination airport didn't disappear. but the operation became trapped between storms, weather minima, diversions, and a preference for a particular alternate. In accident investigations, fixation is understood as an excessive focus on one option, even when the situation demands reassessment. It doesn't imply bad faith. It reflects how the human mind can cling to a plan that seemed correct minutes before. Fuel also generates a particular psychological pressure. When there's enough left, the options seem ample. When it dwindles, each alternative costs more. Changing destination consumes fuel. Waiting for an improvement consumes fuel. Going abort an approach protects against an unsafe landing, but it also consumes fuel. Thus, an operational trap emerges. The longer a conservative decision is delayed, the harder it becomes to execute. In the cockpit of an A320neo, the available information is abundant. There are calculations of estimated fuel, distances, altitudes, weather, communications, and procedures. But more information doesn't eliminate the pressure. In a dynamic situation, the problem lies in transforming data into priorities. The aircraft needs to know which safe runway is closest, under what minimums it can land, and how much fuel will remain upon touchdown. Air safety is built in layers. One layer is planning, another is air traffic control, another is meteorology, another is airline coordination, another is cabin resource management, another is procedural discipline. The Vistara 944 incident demonstrated what happens when several layers don't completely break down, but rather become thinner simultaneously. The plane was still flying. The engines were running. The pilots were in control. ATC was still relaying information. Lucknow was available again. But the margin had already been reduced too much. By the time they finally touched down, the remaining fuel was extremely low for a commercial airliner. The emergency ended without casualties, but not because there was a wide margin. It ended well because the last window of opportunity remained open long enough. A fuel emergency doesn't necessarily look like an explosive failure. There's no smoke, no flying debris, and there doesn't have to be any vibration. From the passenger cabin, it might feel like delays, turns, course changes, and measured announcements. The real threat is in the numbers: kilograms of fuel, flight minutes, miles to the runway, and visibility minimums. In the cockpit, the workload increased. The pilot flying had to maintain trajectory, speed, configuration, and power. The monitoring pilot had to check parameters, manage communications, read lists, calculate fuel, confirm minimums, and compare options. Automation helps, but it doesn't make decisions on its own. The autopilot can follow a route. The flight management system can estimate fuel. The instruments can align the aircraft with a runway. The decision to proceed, abort, or divert belongs to the crew. The concept of a stabilized approach is essential. An aircraft must be correctly configured, aligned, at proper speed, on a descent path, and with consistent power before reaching a certain altitude. If it is not, it must be aborted. This principle exists because many approach and landing accidents began when crews attempted to save poorly configured approaches. But when fuel runs low, a go-around ceases to be a neutral maneuver. It remains mandatory if the approach is unsafe, but its cost increases. This reveals a profound tension in aviation. One defense can trigger another threat. Going around prevents a landing accident, but it can bring about a fuel emergency. Continuing without reference points avoids additional fuel consumption, but it can lead to a runway excursion or a collision. Safety consists of choosing the controllable risk and rejecting the uncontrollable. When an aircraft cannot find the runway, the procedure is not to desperately search for it visually. The approach has limits. If the runway appears late, appears only partially, or does not allow for a safe trajectory, the aircraft must abort. Modern safety culture prefers an uncomfortable go-around to a landing forced by operational pressure. On Vistara 944, the challenge was compounded by the regional weather. Storms do not form static walls. They shift, grow, dissipate, generate gusts, curtains of rain, and sudden changes in visibility. An airport may show above minimum temperatures in one report and below them shortly afterward. This doesn't render weather reports useless. It simply means they should be interpreted as snapshots of a changing reality. Air traffic control plays a critical role. It reports visibility, runway availability, wind, approach clearance, vectors, and priority. But the controller isn't in the cockpit. They don't feel the aircraft's power or see exactly what the crew sees. The final decision to land remains with the cockpit because that's where technical information, performance data, and actual visual conditions are integrated. The airline's structure also comes into play. Operations centers can recommend alternates, assess ground support, review weather, and coordinate assistance. However, under pressure and with dwindling fuel, communication between operations and the cockpit must be clear, direct, and useful. If information arrives late, incomplete, or too logistically biased, it can influence a critical decision. The case revealed an uncomfortable truth. An aircraft doesn't enter an emergency solely because of what happens in the air. Sometimes it gets there due to the interplay of weather, planning, organizational culture, communication, and human biases. The sky is the visible stage, but the causal chain also extends through desks, reports, manuals, dispatch centers, and decisions made before the aircraft enters the critical zone. The idea that an aircraft might not be able to find a runway seems absurd in the age of GPS, radar, ILS, and satellite navigation. But landing isn't simply about reaching coordinates. It's about transferring an aircraft weighing tens of tons from the air to a confined surface at high speed with precise energy and sufficient braking margin. Instrument approach systems allow an aircraft to align with the runway, even without seeing it for much of the descent. The ILS provides lateral and vertical guidance. The localizer indicates whether the aircraft is to the left or right of the runway centerline. The glide slope indicates whether it is high or low relative to the correct profile. Other procedures, such as area navigation-based approaches, also allow for controlled descents. But all have minimums. These minimums exist because instruments guide to a certain point, not to absolute certainty. In the final phase, the crew needs visual references to judge the transition to landing, fine alignment, flare, touchdown, and braking. In extremely low visibility conditions, that transition can be unsafe if the airport, aircraft, or crew are not certified for very low visibility automated operations. Some aircraft and airports permit auto-land landings under advanced categories, but not every runway, crew, airline, or condition allows it. The operation requires certified equipment, specific maintenance, training, procedures, signal protection, and particular minimums. A modern aircraft cannot decide on its own to automatically land on any runway covered by a storm. Moreover, heavy rain affects more than just visibility. It can contaminate the runway, reduce braking, cause hydroplaning, impair visual perception, and generate wind shifts. A safe landing requires both seeing the runway and being able to stop on it. If the surface is wet and a tailwind increases ground speed, the required distance can increase significantly. The tailwind on the approach to Delhi was a red flag. A wet runway with a tailwind reduces margins. In a passenger aircraft, the landing does not end upon touchdown. It ends when the aircraft decelerates under control. The decision to abort due to wind or unstable conditions protects the final part of the event, not just the initial touchdown. The approach to Lucknow highlighted another problem. A runway may be perfectly located on instruments but outside visual minimums. The aircraft may be aligned, descending correctly, and with pilots ready to land. But if visual references are not available, the operation must be abandoned. The runway is not lost. It is blocked by the atmosphere. Commercial aviation embraces this discipline because history has shown the price of ignoring it. Many approach and landing accidents began with seemingly logical reasoning. The runway was close, fuel was low, visibility was good, perhaps they could proceed. Modern safety replaces that impulse with objective limits. If the approach fails, it is aborted. If fuel doesn't allow for another wait, an emergency is declared. If the preferred alternate becomes unfeasible, another is chosen. On Vistara 944, the aborts were in place. The crew aborted the approach when they should have. They declared a fuel emergency. Air traffic control reported changes in visibility. The aircraft eventually landed. But the incident was serious because those aborts operated very close to the edge. The system didn't fail, but it allowed the flight to enter an area where there was no longer any safe margin. After landing, the incident ceased to be solely the responsibility of the crew and became the subject of an investigation. In aviation, investigating doesn't mean finding a single culprit. It means reconstructing the chain of events to understand how a normal operation ended in an emergency. Investigators are analyzing flight data, communications, weather, fuel, plans, decisions, manuals, and operational coordination. The report classified the case as a serious incident. This category acknowledges that there was no accident, but that conditions were close enough to a dangerous outcome to warrant in-depth analysis. The aircraft was undamaged. The occupants survived. The final runway received the flight. But the remaining fuel revealed that the operation had entered an unacceptable zone. The investigation pointed to a combination of factors. One of the central elements was insufficient attention to dwindling fuel and a fixation on the diversion to Lucknow as the preferred alternate. Failures in operational guidance, weather information, and coordination regarding other possible alternates were also noted. The idea was not that a single moment doomed the operation, but rather that several decision points failed to correct the risky trajectory with sufficient advance warning. Choosing an alternate is not simply a matter of distance on a map. An ideal alternate should have stable weather conditions, available approaches, sufficient fuel to reach the airport, operational support, and the capacity to receive the aircraft. If the alternate is also under the influence of storms or requires flying through severe weather, its appeal diminishes. In a monsoon-affected region, a more distant but meteorologically more stable airport may be safer than a closer one within the same convective pattern. Operational fixation is a known phenomenon. Under pressure, the mind can narrow its range of options. An early chosen alternate becomes dominant. The crew continues to update data, but that data may be interpreted around the already selected plan. Changing strategy requires cognitive energy, clear communication, and assertiveness among pilots. That's why cockpit resource management, known as CRM, is so important. CRM aims to make the cockpit function as a cooperative system. The captain has final authority, but the first officer must be able to question, propose, and alert. Hierarchy should not suppress critical information. In fuel incidents, assertiveness can mean the difference between diverting early and being stuck with late options. A clear statement at the right moment can save hundreds of kilograms of fuel. The investigation also examined the organization. An airline must provide clear guidelines for diversions, fuel, alternates, and decisions under adverse weather. Operations centers should support, not create ambiguity. When a company has preferred alternates for technical support or passenger logistics, those preferences should never supersede the operational priority of landing with adequate fuel at a safe airport. Vistara 944 was significant not because it ended in tragedy, but because it demonstrated how a chain of decisions could bring a modern aircraft to the limit of its final fuel reserve. In aviation safety, incidents without fatalities offer a rare opportunity. They allow for the study of the threat without the irreversible cost of an accident. Every kilogram remaining in the tanks becomes a lesson. When a crew declares Mayday Fuel, the flight is reclassified by the system. Air traffic control must prioritize it. Other aircraft may receive vectors, delays, or instructions to clear space. Communication becomes more direct. The aircraft needs the most efficient route to a runway where it can land safely. The term Mayday is traditionally repeated 3 times to avoid confusion. In practice, the phrase communicates an internationally recognized emergency. It is not a request for preferential treatment. It is a declaration that the margin has been exhausted. In an environment with bad weather, other flights, active runways, and missed approaches, that priority can be decisive. But declaring an emergency does not create fuel. It only reorganizes the system around the aircraft. If the runway is still below minimums, priority does not allow for a safe landing. If the wind is out of limits, the emergency does not change the physics. If the aircraft has no visual references, the Mayday does not illuminate the runway. That is why the declaration must come before options become non-existent. Final reserve is a conceptual boundary. In simple terms, it is the fuel that must remain to fly for a certain amount of time under specific conditions, usually associated with a low-altitude holding pattern. It is not a secret tank. It is real fuel inside the wings, but its function is to protect against the final unforeseen event. When it is calculated that the aircraft will land below that reserve, the emergency is no longer potential. It is actual. On Vistara 944, the flight found itself in that critical territory. The crew needed to know which airport was available, which was closest, what the visibility was, which runway could be used, and how much fuel would remain upon landing. Lucknow, which had previously rejected the approach due to insufficient visibility, offered another window. The plane turned back. The shorter distance became decisive. The final approach to Lucknow concentrated all the tension of the case. After several decisions, attempts, and course changes, the aircraft was aligned with the runway. Visibility had improved sufficiently. The pilots had to complete a stable approach, touch down within the designated area, and bring the aircraft to a stop. There was no room for drama. The cockpit operated according to procedures, calls, speeds, and parameters. The landing was completed. The aircraft was on the ground. There were no fires, no mass evacuation, no structural damage. The emergency ended quietly, like many air crises when the system manages to absorb them before disaster strikes. For the passengers, the relief was immediate. For the investigators, the case had just begun. The fuel remaining upon landing became the symbolic data point. A small number turned a story of delay and bad weather into a serious incident. The difference between a safe landing and a catastrophe isn't always measured in kilometers. Sometimes it's measured in minutes. Sometimes in hundreds of kilograms of fuel, sometimes in a single improvement in visibility reported in time. Commercial aviation is often presented as a triumph of technology, and to a large extent, it is. But Vistara 944 showed that safety doesn't come solely from modern aircraft. It comes from conservative decisions, accurate weather information, flexible planning, assertive communication, and the ability to abandon a plan when the environment changes. The aircraft couldn't find the runway in the most human sense of the phrase. It couldn't convert a known location into a safe landing. The runway was there, but the atmosphere obscured it. The instruments guided, but the minimums brought it to a halt. Fuel allowed it to keep flying, but every minute reduced its options. The crew wasn't facing a supernatural mystery, but an operational one. How such a regulated system could become trapped by decisions that, in isolation, seemed understandable. The answer lies in accumulation. A small delay alone doesn't cause an emergency. A storm at the destination alone doesn't cause a crisis. A missed landing isn't a failure. A diversion isn't a hazard. Dropping visibility on the alternate runway isn't anyone's fault. But when all those elements appear in sequence, the operation enters a zone where the margins erode rapidly. The first major lesson was that the alternate airport had to be a real escape route, not a hope. In convective weather, a nearby airport might share the same atmospheric instability as the original destination. Planning must consider not just distances, but entire weather systems. If a storm is covering a region, the best alternate might be the one that breaks through that region, even if it means an earlier decision. The second lesson was that fuel had to govern strategy from the outset, not just when it was running low. A flight with adequate reserves can become vulnerable if it uses up those reserves trying to sustain a plan that is losing validity. Safety demands declaring fuel conditions in advance, requesting priority when appropriate, and preventing the final reserve from becoming a planning tool. The third lesson was in the cockpit. Resource management is not an abstract concept. It means speaking up in time, questioning in time, proposing an alternate in time, and recognizing when a preferred option is no longer the safest. In aviation, the captain's authority is fundamental, but safety increases when the cockpit operates as a distributed mind, not a single will. The fourth lesson belonged to the airlines. Operations centers must provide clear and useful information. Logistical preferences cannot outweigh weather and fuel considerations. An alternate airport with better ground support is valuable only if it is also the best place to land safely. In a real emergency, the passenger needs runway, not convenience. The fifth lesson belonged to the public. An aircraft that aborts an approach is not failing. It is obeying a defense designed to save lives. The sudden engine power surge, the unexpected climb, and the subsequent delay may be frightening, but they are usually signs that the crew is rejecting an unsafe landing. The aborted approach is a prudent maneuver, not a defeat. Vistara 944 finally landed in Lucknow, bringing to a close a story that could have been much worse. The incident was recorded not for destruction, but for its proximity to the limit. That is a special category within aviation safety, events where tragedy is averted, but a clear outline is left. The runway appeared in time, the aircraft touched down, and the system breathed a sigh of relief. However, the question remained hanging over the investigation. How many earlier decisions could have kept the flight away from that edge?